Hey, hi, hello, humans, and welcome to part two of Somatic Healing with yours truly, Sarah Salehi. I'm so excited that you are here to learn about one of the important and amazing human superpowers that we possess called self-regulation. Self-regulation is kind of this overarching, complex, series of behaviors and things that we're doing that enables us to not only manage and monitor our internal states, but also be aware of what's going on in our interaction with other people, and to have this kind of idea that whatever is going on, you're flexible enough to maneuver it so that it ends in a positive note. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. All right, you are sharing screen. Beautiful. And hopefully you can see me on the side there and you can see my screen here. Okay, so the idea of self-regulation is that as we're self-regulating, we are more aware of what state our nervous system is in. So, from part one of Somatic Healing, Introduction to Neuroscience, we learned that we kind of have these different zones that we navigate throughout the day. And one of these zones is the green zone, where our social networking system is online and we're resting and digesting and feeling safe in our environment and internally satiated and warm, and all our needs are being met. And so in this state, our we have access to our voice box. We can create this sound frequency called prosody, which we can hear only when we're in our safe state, because the internal ear or the mid ear physiologically changes to pick up on this frequency of prosody. And we talked about that being like all the Disney songs sung in prosody, like, oh, so that kind of puts you in this state of safety. And during those times when we're having interactions from that state, we're creating really deep bonds. And we're creating these like trust bonds with people that last a long time. And so these humans become our like soul brothers and sisters that kind of carry us throughout the rest of our suffering or the rest of our journey in our lives. It's like the person that you call when shit hits the fan. This is like how you created those social bonds, is when you were in the green zone. And now say that you're doing your thing and then all of a sudden you have to mobilize your nervous system. Either you got triggered or there's physical harm coming to you. And so in those states, you're kind of in the yellow zone, this fight flight, and your body is mobile and you're responding in ways that's going to make sure that you survive. And so that could be if your boundary's been broken, you respond in anger, or if you're, somebody who's avoidant, if you're in a conflict, you might run the other way. So it just is like your trauma response when you have to mobilize your body. And then we talked about this red zone where you're in immobility or a state of dissociation and freeze. And that usually happens when there's either prolonged exposure to trauma, or the situation is so traumatizing that the human inner animal feels like, okay, I'm just gonna lay down and die now. It's hopeless and helpless, and like I can't, nothing I do can change the things that are happening. And so we found that research shows that a healthy nervous system is aware of the different emotional signatures, so how your emotions respond in the green, yellow versus red zone, and how your physical sensory system feels like. So if you're angry, do you see red? Can you recognize that you're angry? And can you identify the different states that your body is in, like body temperature rising, or feeling cold, like stuff like that. So as we have more and more information, we're capable of navigating between these different states more and more, and feeling less and less like we're in that red zone, that we're away from the feeling of helpless and hopelessness. We've got enough tools in our armory that we can self-regulate and help ourselves overcome whatever has triggered us. Okay, so let's learn about this complex structure today. The underlying physiological things that are happening while we're self-regulating is neuroplasticity. And we talked about neuroplasticity as the brain's ability or the nervous system's ability to grow new connections and to expand like whatever connections it already has through the process of learning. And so we're going to be talking about neuroplasticity and the research behind that, but that is to understand that we're self-regulating through the process of neuroplasticity. And so we use yoga as a framework to organize how we can have tools to equip our body, and through what methodology can our physiology be tapped into so that we're less and less likely to be triggered. And then we'll dive into some really cool research that's going to basically bring these intrinsic feelings out onto paper and show us some really cool studies to back up this philosophy. Okay. So when we're talking about self-regulation, it is a very complex series of things happening, which is the ability to first manage and monitor our internal states, which are emotions, thoughts, and our behaviors. And so, why do we want to become aware of our internal states? Is because when you're aware of your internal states and you know yourself really well, and something happens, say you're triggered, but the trigger is because of a memory and the past has been set off. Um, you're more likely to respond in a flexible, humane, and acceptable manner. And so, what do I mean when I say that? So, let's think about this example of a mom who just got her house uh, freshly painted, and her while she was on the phone with her mom or her friend, her child is like drawing on the freshly painted walls. Obviously, that could trigger someone, right? It happens to the best of us. And so, maybe acceptable manner of behaving towards this is to think like, whatever my child has done, is it unethical? Is it harmful? Is it causing like long-lasting effects? And so, really, the idea of a child drawing on the wall is not that big of a deal, even though you might feel like there's so many things that now I have to do. But in the overarching things, it's not that big of a deal. It's not really unethical or harmful. So, an acceptable manner of behavior would be maybe to take away the drawing tools from your little kid and in a calm voice or tone that they can understand. Um, explain to them why we don't do that, and maybe you busy them with something else. An unacceptable manner of behavior would be, to reprimand them harshly because of the thing that they're doing. Because we want to save those harsh reprimands for moments where they're really going to have long-lasting effects, where you're like doing something seriously harmful or unethical, and you tell your child like no, and whether you're using whatever your language is to explain that. And another unacceptable manner would be to hit your kid because they drew on the wall. So that's what I'm talking about when I say acceptable manner. It's to kind of like navigate through these states. And so the idea of responding in a flexible and humane manner is so that we can create positive results. And why do we want to create positive results? Is because when our focus or our intent is to come from a place of long lasting positive results, it actually shows that it enhances our well being. And it correlates with creating meaningful relationships. And if we're looking at it from that perspective, then every interaction that we're having is a practice that will lead to learning and understanding more about ourselves. And so the underlying physiological process that allows self-regulation to happen is this idea of neuroplasticity, of the human nervous system being able to adapt, overcome, and grow and learn. Mm, okay. So here I have some depictions of what it would look like to be in a state of trigger. So fight, flight. You might have seen this slide from our first lecture. It's this idea that things are so overwhelming for you, like the discomfort that being triggered results in, seeing red or feeling like I can't handle this. And it's like elicits this response of like that dog husky in the middle, like, I'm just gonna rip people off, or feeling like isolated and your needs not being met, So when you're in a state of fight flight and you're mobilizing your human nervous system, that's from our animalistic brain. So imagine constantly responding from that place. And that's what most people are doing. And so you can see that it doesn't really result in positive enhanced well-being when you're responding from a place of being triggered. So we call this the idea of being able to monitor and manage our internal states so that we recognize like, oh, look, I'm going to a gathering where like a lot of my family members are going to be, and I just know that my family members trigger me. And so maybe I'll take some steps before um going there to ensure that like I'm not, my boundaries aren't crossed, or if they're crossed, that I have some plan in place to take care of myself. Okay, maybe you can relate to that. And you can fill in your own example of when you've felt this overwhelming feeling of discomfort in your own body and you came from a place of reaction. Mm, okay. So in Buddhist or in scripture, like in old yogic texts, they kind of have this analogy that the human mind is likened to a lake. And the lake, imagine on a windy day, has a lot of waves and a lot of activity happening. And so, this idea of this wavy lake is our busy mind, which in scripture is called chittavritti or monkey mind. It jumps from one thought to another and is very busy. So, that kind of mind is either focused on the future or something of the past. It's not in the present moment. And so in this self-regulation, for us to be able to uh, monitor and manage our internal states, we need to be able to still the mind and create like this surface of the lake you can see here in this green image. And like let me tell you right now that there's no such thing as never having thought. Like thoughts are just floating around. They're like waves in the sea or clouds in the sky. They're comings and goings. But the idea is that you are able to pull back from being the wave to being the whole body of water, or being just the cloud to being the sky mind. So watching what's going on. And in the watching, you're monitoring. And when you're getting better and better at monitoring, then you can actually start to manage your state. So, maybe something happens, you get triggered, you notice your breathing is affected, and then you start to breathe longer inhales, slower exhales. So that is definitely a foundation of self-regulation. And so self-regulation happens in the present moment. I kind of put this picture here as it happens when you kind of stop to smell the flowers. So you have to be in this practice of stilling your busy mind, calming the waves, getting in touch with your internal states as opposed to identifying with them. It's like you're a player on the theater of your mind, and then you pull back and become the director in the audience. So that's where this idea of yoga comes into play. How does the practice of yoga connect us to our nervous system? How is it relevant to self-regulation? So our ancestors from 4,000 years ago were very wise, and they deciphered these 8 limbs that they've called yoga, which means unity. Unity is basically self-regulation. So you're yoking all of your internal states, thoughts, triggers, emotions, sensations, to become aware of them in the present moment. So we do that by taking part in these limbs. We can utilize the limbs of yoga, kind of like the pillars, to enhance our ability to become mindful and land in the present moment and be able to self-regulate. So there's these ideas that will start at the top of yamas and niyamas. And yamas are behavioral restraints. So one of the yamas is a parigraha, which means non-hoarding or non-attachment. So it's looking at your relationship with everything around you and everything inside of you. So how do you attach to things? How attached are you to your hair? How attached are you to your youth? How attached are you to your favorite dessert? How attached are you to your family? How codependent are you? It's all of these kinds of like um, studies of the self by looking at ourselves through these lenses. And like exactly like the niyamas or these observances. So you might say that you're taking an observance of brahmacharya, which means noticing and restraining your sexual energy. And so that's kind of weird because, as I said, like we're animals and reproduction is kind of our main goal for survival. But at the same time, we've developed this prefrontal cortex and this complex structure of social behaviors that are acceptable. And so observances are like noticing, how do you present yourself to the sex that you're attracted to, and how do you respond? How flirtatious are you? Like all of these things is like noticing how that your past has affected your behavior in the present. Asana, which is basically what everybody thinks of when they think of yoga, is the physical posture. So, through the physicality of yoga, we're putting our body in a state of discomfort. Think about something like runner's lunge. Your gaze is lowered, and we know how important our gaze is for our system to feel safe. And you got your arms back, one leg is stepped back, one knee is bent forward. You're in a lunge. You're kind of restraining your whole torso at an angle, so it's a little uncomfortable for the body to be in that structure. And through being in that discomfort, we're overriding our animalistic fight flight response of saying like, oh, what's happening? Like, is my animal in danger? Do I need to mobilize myself? And saying, no, I'm breathing. I'm aware of my body in space, and I've got like expression added to this. And so that's kind of the idea of asana, that when you have a physical practice, and it doesn't just have to be yoga, but it has to be something mindful, like something that you're linking with breath. That you become more and more aware of your internal states. And pranayama, we all know, is the control of breath, longer inhales for anxiety, longer exhales to get rid of rage and anger. And then there's other examples. So pratyahara is taking away the senses. And the best way that I can explain this to you is kind of understanding like fasting. We're so addicted to foods, and foods change our internal states. Like most of us are sugar junkies, myself included. I love chocolate. And so, when I restrain myself from taking chocolate, and I notice like I'm like hangry, even though I've eaten other things, but like I'm craving that chocolate like crack. So withdrawing the senses brings into awareness that our physiology can change as a result of the things that we're attached to, that our senses require. And then we have on the left side where you're looking at the screen, these higher functioning limbs. So samadhi is like being in a contemplative state. It's a meditative state. Dhyana is that meditative state of mindfulness, like becoming aware of breath. And then dharana is concentration, which is concentration is necessary for all of these other limbs. So how do you train your concentration? So back in the day, maybe they would do something as intense as like 99 kapalabhati breaths to enhance their concentration of being able to do that even though you're feeling uncomfortable. Or like think about a kundalini practice where you're singing over and over while doing these kriyas or movements that require a lot of concentration. So all of these limbs or all of these practices are kind of tools in your armory of resilience that can enable you to get deeper into knowing yourself, which is why yoga is such an incredible framework for the practice of self-regulation. And so Here is me talking about all of these things, but let's go look at what research is showing us. And you know what? If you need a break, this is a great time to pause the video and go for a pee break or have a beverage. I'm going to do that too. Good. All right. Let's dive in to research. We'll start from molecular, so we'll zoom into the body, and then we'll work our way up out into tissue, into brain structures, and then into behavior. Okay, so here I've put some blobs on the side. These are cells. Inside them are tons of molecules. Each cell has its own kind of like factory that builds the proteins that it needs. It has a nucleus that has its blueprint, the DNA inside it. There's lots going on. And within the neurons, which we talked about last time, the specialized cells of the nervous system that have that elongated tail, we can see neurotransmitters, these chemicals that communicate between neurons, that communicate between neurons and muscles and neurons and glands and whatever else the neurons are talking to. And so each of these molecules is kind of like a different language that the neuron can speak to activate different kinds of uh, responses. So we talked about GABA in the first lecture as gaminobutyric acid, and this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that is necessary for a state of meditation. So when we're in a state of meditation, remember we talked about that monkey mind, that chitta vritti? We want to inhibit a lot of that, and we do that by concentrating. So I come from the school of meditation called Vipassana or Vipassana, and if when I was in my meditative state, if someone were to take and draw blood from my body, they would see an decrease in my cortisol levels, which is the stress hormones in the body, and an increase in this inhibitory molecule called GABA, and an increase in this hormone called oxytocin, which has been labeled the love hormone, but is actually for connection. So when we're connecting at a deep level that we were talking about in that green zone, we're producing oxytocin. When mothers hold their babies for the first time and their eyes lock onto each other, they produce a surge of oxytocin that kind of rips this network in their brain. It's like, this is my human to take care of, the love bond solidifies there. So we know that in a practice of yoga, we're increasing inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA, decreasing stress hormones like cortisol, and increasing these kind of celebratory hormones or neurotransmitters such as oxytocin that enhance our well-being. Literally, oxytocin is released in the body when you receive healing touch from someone, not just like any kind of touch, but if you receive touch in a way that makes your body feel really good. So for example, when I see clients for Thai massage, most of the time people want to be touched around their neck. So when they're receiving the touch in just the way that makes them feel really safe and good, oxytocin is released and tissue goes into healing when the body is in that hormonal state. This is amazing. So at any state, at any time when we're in the moment, all of the things that are happening, all of the different processes of the different parts of the brain talking to each other, visual information coming into the back of the brain, sensory, hearing, olfactory from smelling, proprioception, where is the body in space, interoception, what's the internal states, all of that is creating this energetic output in the brain that we can measure by connecting electrodes to the brain, which causes waves of energy to be produced. And so on the right side of the screen, as you're looking at the screen, we're going to look at the brainwaves chart. So when you're alert, you're in this state of beta waves, and beta waves have a frequency of 12 to 30 hertz, and they're very, very fast. So if you think about it, like, you have a cup of coffee, you're on the phone getting shit done. That's that alert state, beta waves. And when you're in that state for a prolonged period of time, it burns you out. And then we have this like other state of alpha waves, which has a lower frequency, so 7.5 to 12 hertz. It's not as fast as beta waves, but they kind of call it the contemplative or meditative state. And I kind of like to describe it as like, when you have a moment where everything is quiet, the sun is shining, maybe you're surrounded by your loved ones, like you kind of step out of the picture and see like, wow, how blessed your life is. That's kind of this alpha wave. Okay. And so when you practice alpha wave, it could lead to creating a state that's deeply relaxed, which is known as theta waves. Um, Theta, the symbol in Greek, is a frequency that's much lower than alpha waves. It's basically 4 to 7 hertz. And so that's kind of like that lucid state, yoga nidra, the yogic sleep state, like just before you're falling into deep sleep. This is that deep relaxation state. And then when we're sleeping, our brain is kind of doing housekeeping and cleaning. And that's this delta wave state, which is the lowest frequency. So what happened was this Greek research group led by a researcher named Logopoulos in 2009. This is like the first research study that happened. They took a group of like normal human individuals and they taught them to meditate. And they were meditating, I think like they meditated 20 minutes every day. And so focusing on their breathing, like taking in their internal states, becoming aware of their thought patterns. And so what happened after a week when they measured these people, they realized when they're in a meditative state, their brain, first of all, had more alpha and theta states and which is amazing. So it was easier for them to go from beta waves into a state of alpha or theta. And so like, if you use drugs, you can also tap into these different waves. So for example, marijuana enhances your alpha wave state, which is why you could feel like you're in the flow type of deal. So as we're looking at all of these research that we're talking about, when we want to talk about behavior, we have to kind of construct these ideas. So we talked about when we're practicing yoga at a molecular level, our inhibitory neurotransmitters such as GABA increase, our stress hormones decrease, and we are more likely to be in that state of flow where the love hormone is produced, where we're healing our body. So that's at the molecular level. And then we came into this kind of brainwave state. And so looking at brainwaves is like energetic output. And we learned that when we're meditating or when we've been practicing meditation, even for a short period of time, we see brainwave changes from a state of beta or alert to more alpha and theta, which is incredible, incredible. And so when we want to talk about behavior, we kind of have to understand this idea of cognition. And cognition is higher functioning or superhuman powers, basically, like memory, perception, language, imagination, are all under this idea of cognition. And so this paper came out, which we're going to be ending our lecture with because it's a little bit complex, but this guy named Gard and his colleagues went and took every research paper on yoga and they did a meta-analysis. So they ran all of the data and were like, what are these studies looking at? So they took from like molecular all the way to behavioral. And what they found was yoga enhances our ability to regulate ourselves, not only through bottom up regulation, so not only through understanding and monitoring our internal states, but also through top down, which means using these big systemic, like synergizing networks that are talking to each other to manage our animalistic behaviors. And so keep that in your mind because we're going to come back to this. So before we move on to Tim Gard's work, I kind of want to talk about this research idea that takes a look at the brain as a whole and where blood flows in the brain, that's where activity is happening. And so Andrew Newberg looked at the neurophysiology of religious and spiritual practices. And he used this machine called a single photon emission tomography, or a SPECT imaging machine, to measure the blood flow of the brain of people in states of spiritual and religious practices, which is weird, right? And so we're likening the state of spiritual or religious practice to the idea of being in a state of neuroplasticity and self-regulating. So when you're measuring blood flow, where there's more blood, it correlates with more activity. And so red is the most blood, then yellow, then green, then blue, and black is like nothing happening in that area. So what did he do? He went and took a look at a bunch of Tibetan Buddhist meditators. And while they were meditating, he hooked them up and he measured the activity of their brain flow. And so the idea is that when you're in space, like as you're moving around, there's a part of your parietal lobe that is associated with giving you this idea of how you're oriented in space and time. It's like a timestamp on what's going on. So if you've ever taken class with me, I might say something like, locate yourself in space, orient yourself to where you are. And so it's that dropping into where am I physically in space. And so that's represented in the parietal lobe. And so they kind of hypothesize that when monks are in a meditative state, that there's going to be a decreased activity in these areas because monks described that when they were meditating, they were in this state of flow, or they were floating. This concept of gate gate paragate, like gone, gone, gone beyond, so deep inside that you're not aware of the external world. And so that was their hypothesis, that there's going to be decreased activity in those parietal or orientation centers in the parietal lobe. And so what we see here is at baseline, so when they weren't meditating, their brain is actually having very good conversation all around, which is really highly energy consuming for the brain to be constantly in a state of awareness. Like, try to sit for meditation for 10 minutes and see how exhausting it is. So being aware of your current state of presence requires a lot of different body parts to talk to each other, which will look like this brain on the left-hand side at the bottom, a brain that's aware of a state of, where am I in space? What's happening? Let me read the room. So when they looked at the same brains in a state of meditation, they found that exactly like they hypothesized, there is a decrease in activity on the right-hand side in the parietal lobe where the orientation areas are. Therefore, giving them, enough proof that, yes, actually, when you're in a state of meditation, you don't have an idea of a state of space, of time and space. You're in the flow. It's pretty cool. And so they were like, okay, so now we know they don't have a state of or they're not really orienting into physical space when we're meditating and tuning in, when we're doing that internal managing. But what they wanted to see was, okay, if you are meditating and it's requiring so much cognition, and we know the house of cognition is in the frontal lobes from our first lecture. So we know that meditation requires a high degree of concentration, and concentration lives in the frontal lobes. When you have activity in the frontal lobe, it increases blood flow there. And so they said, if we have increased frontal lobe activity, that means we have decreased parietal activity. So we are increasing our concentration, that dharana, the limb of yoga, in a state of meditation in our attention areas. And that's taking so much energy, and we're taking that energy away from that orientation space. So what they found was, in the picture at baseline, can you see there's kind of like a disconnect between where the frontal lobes or the attention areas are and the rest of the brain? So what they found was, in the attention areas, when you're meditating, it increases blood flow activity, and not just to the attention areas, but look at the brain on the right. It has more red, like noticeably more red and more connected all around, compared to the baseline brain that's not in a state of meditation. It's kind of like la di da, okay, I'm hungry, maybe I'll go eat. Maybe it's like training time for the Tibetan monks. I don't know. So at baseline, it's a little bit disconnected, not as much brain activity. But when you're in your concentration, in your meditative state, then you have increased activity in your attention areas and just a general increased activity in the brain as a whole, which goes along with why this could create, when you're concentrating, why it could correlate with those theta and alpha waves at the energetic level, and why it correlates at the molecular level with the changes we saw. So they weren't just happy with taking Tibetan Buddhist monks. So they thought, okay, we're going to go and take a bunch of Italian nuns, and we're going to see what's the difference between their brains and the Buddhist monks. So we saw an increased activity in the frontal lobes of the Buddhist monks. And so here, if you can look at the picture with me, in baseline scans, we see there's like synergy going all along the brain, but there's way less red. And in the time when the nuns are praying, which is akin to Buddhist monks being in a state of meditation, because the state of prayer is that God-like state, the state of presence, we see in the prayer scan that the frontal lobes have much more increased red activity. And then something really interesting happened. What they found, the researchers, was that there was also increased activity in this area of the brain known as the language centers, which is in the inferior or bottom part of the parietal lobes. And so what they hypothesized was that because nuns are verbally practicing prayer, they're saying hymns, HYMN, their prayers, that obviously they're going to be activating those areas versus the Buddhist monks that only do observation or visualization meditation. And that's prefrontal cortex activity. So based on the type of prayer, we see different parts of the brain activated, which is so fascinating because it's showing us that you can use mantras, which is similar to prayers. You can use visualization, you can use breath practice in honing in your focus, and overall, it will show increased activity in your attention areas or in your prefrontal cortex necessary for concentration and meditation. And based on what method you use, you will also see activities in those parts of the brain. So if you are going to be meditating through, prayer, then you're going to see activity in your language centers. If you're going to be meditating through visualization, then we're going to see activity in the occipital regions that correlate with those visualizations. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of the brain research, we're going to come to this beautiful paper that kind of changed the history of yoga and research. Because if you think about it, yoga has a bad rep in the West as kind of like Beverly Hills moms in their Lululemon outfits, in their hot yogas with their handstands and their headstands. And so it's kind of, sullied this beautiful and incredibly powerful ancient practice that is so much more than than the asana practice. And so they kind of put the practice of yoga on the map for researchers to be like, okay, there's actually something going on here. Let's go and figure out what it is. So Tim Gard and his buddies took all of the different research papers from all around the world up until 2014, and they ran it through a complex system called meta-analysis, which basically takes apart all the different methodologies that are used So whether it was molecular research, whether it was like changes in brain waves, changes through the brain scans, changes in behavior observations, like tests of depression given before and after um, doing meditation and yoga. It's like they took all of that and they published a paper called Potential Self-Regulatory Mechanisms of Yoga for Psychological Health. And they published it in this really sexy journal called Frontiers of Human Neuroscience, which is like creme de la creme in the neuroscience research. And when the paper was published, basically, this is what we saw, is that when you're practicing yoga and meditation, you're honing in these systems that are working at very complex, high energy levels, not that different from the monks meditating. And the top down processes, so from cognition controlling the animalistic body, we see these networks, the frontoparietal control network talking to the central executive network and activating the moral cognition network. So what the hell are these things? We're going to talk about that. And then they saw from the bottom up processes that people that were practicing yoga, they were better at interoception, so understanding their internal states. They were better at monitoring and managing their parasympathetic to sympathetic nervous system activity, so their fight flight response. And they had a means of tapping into their vagal tone. So we talked about vagal tone as this idea that the nervous system has this executive nerves called the what do you call it? Cranial nerves. There are 12 of them. And the vagus nerve wanders all through the body and is constantly sending information, talking to our lungs, talking to our heart, talking to our diaphragm, talking to our social activation system, talking to our guts for digestion. And so we were better at monitoring and regulating the vagal tone through breathing. Oh my God, so cool. Okay, so let's talk about it. So remember at the beginning of this lecture, I talked about that idea that, you're a mom and you just got your walls painted and you were on the phone. And while you were on the phone, your like 2-year-old took markers and painted all over the wall. So in this situation, we're going to see how this mom can self-regulate. Say this mom is a practitioner of meditation and yoga. And so let's go back to this slide. So as she's on the phone talking, she becomes aware of this situation. And then she notices, oh, internal states. So maybe she gets triggered. She notices, oh my God, I'm upset right now. Like I just spent so much money doing this. And now like I have to do all this planning to do it again, get painters and organize things. And logistically, it's a lot of work. So she's interocepting, noticing she's triggered. And monitoring that like, okay, I'm entering the yellow zone. And so in that moment, the emotions that she's going through is this bottom-up processing. So she's going to tell whoever she's on the phone with, like say it's your mom or whatever, and like, Mom, listen, I need to hang up right now. Something happened. I'm going to fill you in later. So you click the phone off. Those actions are through your interoception. You need to hang up. You need your full attention on this. And then maybe that things like this, when you get triggered like this, like it burns you out and later you'll have a headache. And so in that moment, maybe you decide to walk to your medicine cabinet and take an Advil. I don't know, maybe you're that kind of a person. So that walking and taking the Advil is this bottom-up processing, is like you're using your sensory system to go and take care of yourself. And so your frontoparietal control network is like, okay, now I've taken care of myself. I need to concentrate on how to deal with this. You go take a wipe. You go to your child. Here, your moral cognition system is like, okay, wait a minute. Is this something that's harmful? Is this unethical, what my child has done? Like, does this deserve a slap or a smack or like some serious punishment. And so your moral cognition network being honed in through, concentration, meditation, yoga pipes up and is like, no, no, it's not. Right now, I just need to remove child from situation and like take care of whatever else I need to. So when you tell your child, okay, honey, like we don't want to draw on the wall. Why don't you come over here? You wipe their hands for them. Maybe you give them a snack to occupy them. And I don't know, maybe you even give them the iPad so they're distracted. And then you go back to the wall and your central executive nervous is like, okay, how do I deal with this right now? And for the sake of this story, let's just say that you look at the package of the markers and you realize they're actually water soluble. So you can just wash the wall right now. So going through those is all of these different systems talking to each other and enabling your body to do movements and things and take action in order for you to be able to self-regulate, to be able to have a kind of response to this situation that is correlated with the magnitude of harm and whatever it's causing. What I mean by that is that in the bigger picture, it's not that big of a deal. And so maybe in that moment, you're like, wait a minute, this is actually kind of cute. You take your phone and you take a picture and you send that picture, like you share it with your network of people. And you're even able to laugh about it. So as you calmed and cooled yourself down and went through the steps and you had a positive response, you were flexible in managing your triggers and your responses, and you enhanced the well-being, your own well-being, by not giving into your trigger. You did both bottom-up processing and top-down processing. And so when we're self-regulating, we get better at interoception, noticing our internal states. We get better at integrating what the internal states mean when we're in our environment, that reading of the room. And we become more aware of our animal responses, our reactions, so we can inhibit ourselves better. And when we inhibit ourselves better, we improve the prediction. It's like, okay, I'm going into this situation. I know based on previous experiences that in this situation, I feel X, Y, and Z. So now that I'm going into this situation, I'm prepared to either feel X, Y, and Z, and I have a means to like calm and cool myself down after, or what it is that because I know I don't want to experience X, Y, and Z, I'm going to boundary and not even put myself in that situation. And so as you do this, you become better at error correction. And I'll give you an example for this. So say when you were little, you had an experience with a snake. Maybe it was a garden snake or something like that. And the reason I'm telling you this is because one of my best friends is like terrified of snakes. And whenever we're going for a walk and she's walking, she always mistakes sticks and long things for snakes. And she's always like freaking out, right? So as she's meditating and practicing self-regulation, she's like, okay, I am afraid of snakes. When I go on walks, I mistake sticks for snakes. So she's integrating this. She's interocepting to know that she's feeling fear. When she's going on the walks, her walk the next time, and she sees a stick, she's like, wait a minute, is that a snake or is it a stick? So she's capable of inhibiting the fear response by knowing that in the past, she has mistaken sticks for snakes and has had a response for no reason. So she's improved her prediction so that now she knows that thing that she thinks is a snake is actually an error. It's triggering her. And so this is like a very simple, basic example to give you, but maybe you can take a look at your own life and the way that things trigger you when you put yourself in specific situations. Maybe you don't even know that they're triggering you, but now that you kind of understand, you're starting to understand your internal states better, maybe you can recognize how in different situations, which state you're in, what the emotional signatures are, so that you can make better predictions of how you want to like make responsible choices of how you want to show up in your interactions. What interactions are worthy of your responses and what isn't, you know? So basically, in a nutshell, the benefits of yoga practice manifest on a physiological and psychological and behavioral level. Wow. Molecular, brainwave, cellular changes, systemic changes as a whole brain, waves changing, where the blood is flowing is changing. And the process is mediated by neuroplasticities, the brain's ability to adapt to change and form new connections through learning and experience. And if you're interested, here are some questions that you can reflect upon. Question number 3, maybe you don't know the 4 principles of yin, but look them up. One of them is breathing. One of them is being in a state of discomfort. One of them is giving yourself time. And the last one is integrating all of that information. So if you look at it specifically through the lens of that, if you've ever been to a yin practice with me, describe your own process through that lens. There's some fun questions you can look and see if it tickles your fancy. And lastly, this is a lot of information that I've just digested. I've tried to, give yourself time to digest this. Um, Ask any questions following up with me. You know how to find me. From my heart to yours, it's been an honor and a pleasure. I hope that you're as lit by this information as I was in sharing it with you. Namaste.